country in Europe, we'll be much better off.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start actually by thanking all the hard-working people who keep our public sector and our public services going day in and day out. They're not responsible for the fact that our country is so bogged down in backlogs and bureaucracy. And indeed, as we've heard throughout this debate today, their professionalism and dedication to public service stands in stark contrast to the shambolic performance of this Conservative government. I'd also like to thank honourable members who've, through speeches and interventions to this important debate, and particularly on these benches, who've expressed genuine concern on behalf of their constituents about the desperate state of the Prime Minister's backlog Britain, as opposed to those who've attempted to defend the indefensible. My honourable friend, the member for Bristol North West, made a thoughtful speech, pointed out that if ministers were running a business, it would be bankrupt by now. My honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Hall Green, gave a barnstorming speech. Welcome to backlog Britain, thanks to 12 years of Conservative government, I think is the line that came through very clearly. My honourable member, my honourable friend, the member for Reading East, called on the government to learn the lessons and focused in particular on the chaos at the Passport Office. And my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port, recounted the appalling costs to his constituents of the backlogs and dysfunction at the heart of this government, demonstrated by the failure to answer his basic parliamentary questions. Mr. Deputy Speaker, members on the benches opposite consistently attempt to blame COVID and the lockdowns for the mess in which we now find ourselves. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, backlog Britain cannot be blamed simply on COVID and the lockdowns, because the reality is that the underlying causes of the mess that we're in predate the pandemic, and the challenges we now face have got worse since the end of lockdown, because backlog Britain has been created by two basic failures. Firstly, a failure of resilience, caused by a decade of underinvestment from the Conservatives in British businesses and public services. And secondly, a failure of governance, caused by ministers walking away from their responsibilities and utterly failing to plan for the end of the COVID restrictions. And when you combine these two fundamental failures with the fact that we have a law-breaking Prime Minister who has lost the confidence of 40% of his own MPs and has basically become a national embarrassment, then you have all the ingredients for a catastrophic breakdown in the systems and institutions that keep our country going. Turning first to the failure of resilience. The decade leading up to the pandemic was defined by a staggering lack of investment by the government in the private sector, which led to low growth and weakened British business. So much so that Britain became the European capital for hostile foreign takeovers. The Conservatives failed miserably to meet the average growth rate for similarly developed countries, and as a result, the government unlocked less private investment than in all but two of those 38 comparable countries. If the government had matched that growth rate, then the Treasury would now have £12 billion extra in the Exchequer. And if it had matched the growth rates that were achieved by Labour governments between 1997 and 2010, they would have an extra £40 billion to spend. Low growth meant less money to invest in public services. NHS waiting lists were already at record highs. And, as my honourable friend, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, pointed out in his opening contribution, there were already more than 100,000 staff vacancies, while court backlogs were already growing by 23% in 2020. Lower growth inevitably meant weaker public services and less flexible local government, resulting in a less resilient economy and public sector. It also left our critical national infrastructure dangerously reliant on China for everything from personal protective equipment to our nuclear energy supply. Mr. Deputy Speaker, resilience is about being able to absorb and bounce back from shocks when they hit you. But that lost decade of underinvestment removed our shock absorbers. The British state was surviving hand to mouth. It was walking on thin ice. It was hollowed out by the toxic combination of incompetence and indifference that has characterised successive Conservative governments since 2010. And now we see this ice is breaking, and the result, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is Backlog Britain.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Given that there have been 4 Conservative election victories, or at least 4 Conservative governments, is it the case that actually he's saying that people can't be trusted? Is it the case that the Conservative government are not as bad as he actually says? Or is it the case that the Labour Party have been particularly hopeless at actually giving an alternative message? It must be one of those 3 things.
Kinnock.
Well, the British people participate in democratic elections when we see the desperately bad results of what this Conservative government is delivering. I am absolutely confident that at the next general election they will deliver a landslide Labour government, and then we will see the changes that our country needs to see, rather than the incompetence and indifference that we see from the party opposite. And this leads me to the second fundamental failure, the failure of basic competent governance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you don't have to be Mystic Meg to know that when the pandemic abated, then the lockdown restrictions would be lifted. And we all knew that GP, A&E and hospital waiting lists were all skyrocketing, with 4,500 fewer GPs to take appointments than 10 years ago. We also knew the court backlog was at a record high, with the victims of the most serious violent crimes, including rape, having to wait 2 or 3 years for a case to come to court. And we knew that people would want to go on holiday and that they would need passports. There's no need for a crystal ball here. It was happening in front of our very eyes. But while AstraZeneca and the NHS were rolling out the vaccine at speed, the UK government was patting itself on the back and wheeling suitcases full of booze into number 10. Backlog Britain represents a shameful dereliction of duty by a Prime Minister who is utterly out of his depth. Instead of meeting Britain's challenges, he prefers government by gimmick. Lots of big, flashy announcements, but nothing ever seems to get delivered. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is not designed to solve any of the immediate problems and will take months to get through Parliament. The Bill of Rights is an empty distraction that will actually just increase the backlogs in the court system. And the government has sent £120 million of taxpayers' money to the Rwandan government for a press release. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a world of difference between campaigning and governing. And this government appears to be permanently stuck in campaign mode, constantly hunting for wedge issues that will enable them to pick fights and sow division, inflaming tension rather than building consensus. And they're not even campaigning for the Conservative Party, Mr. Deputy Speaker. No, their campaigns are focused on one aim and one aim only: throwing red meat to the backbenches so the Prime Minister could carry on squatting in Downing Street. Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the many fundamental differences between the members on the benches opposite and we on these benches is that we believe in an active state. We believe that the state should work in partnership with the private sector and civil society to facilitate sustainable economic growth and the smooth running of the systems and institutions that underpin and empower our economy and our communities. We believe in investing in the private sector to grow so that British businesses can create jobs, improve productivity and compete internationally, rather than sell out to the highest foreign bidder. We believe in investing in public services so that NHS hospitals don't have to choose between treating COVID or screening cancer. And we know that the backlogs are clogging up our courts, our ports, our A&E departments, our GP surgeries, the passport office, the DVLA and our asylum system. It's holding our country back. Those on the other side of the House do all they can to avoid any state support whatsoever. They see government as the very last resort, and the result is the mess that we are in. The result is Backlog Britain. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a government that fails to plan is a government that plans to fail. A government that fails to build resilience is a government that leaves us exposed to shocks. A government that blames anyone and everything for its own failures is never going to step up and take responsibility for cleaning up the mess that it has made. And a government that is led by a man who is utterly unfit for public office is bound to end in disaster. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Backlog Britain is the consequence of all these failings, and the British people deserve better than this.
Hear, hear, hear.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And